Hi folks, welcome to our course in genetics. This introduction, which will be pretty short, is not to introduce any content, but to set the scene. Why is studying genetics important? Why does it take up a quarter of our year 12 course? What does it explain for us? And what's its importance beyond science, beyond just school biology? So let's start with DNA, which you've all heard about and you probably know stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and you probably remember a little bit from previous years. But DNA, the discovery of DNA and the understanding of DNA has really revolutionized biology. But the knowledge about it, although that has exploded, didn't begin recently. The discovery of an acidic molecule in the nucleus was made in the 19th century. And as scientists, as biologists realized there was a lot of this stuff, and they suspected that it was important, they began further work on it, and that work became more sophisticated, it became more chemical in nature, and eventually the structure of DNA was subjected to a thing called X-ray crystallography. And the purpose of that is to show the shape of molecules, which have a pattern. And eventually, after decades of work, in 1953, Watson and Crick, two British biochemists, had understood what the shape was. And the shape is the classic double helix shape, which we have all seen, and we will talk about in more detail later on. Once they had found that, then other scientists were able to set to work and work out how the code inside DNA worked and how the code inside DNA turns into our bodies, into the biology that we see in us and in dogs and cats and trees and plants and bacteria. And that is the revolution in biology. And because of that, so much of the variation that we see in organisms, the fact that you, excuse me, are similar to your parents, but not the same as them. You're similar to your brothers and sisters, but not the same as them. And certainly we are similar to each other as humans, but different from lions and kangaroos and jellyfish and the other organisms in the biosphere. So genetics does a very good job of explaining not just that we are very highly varied, but how we're highly varied, how that variation is caused. So I'm going to give you some examples, and this is the first example. This is not a photoshopped dolphin. It's a real dolphin. It hasn't been chemically treated, but it is a genetic mutant, and it is probably an albino. That is to say, it has no pigment in its skin. The reason that it's pink is probably because the blood circulating near the surface gives it a reddish color, but because it's submerged below some layers of skin without color, it comes across as pink. The thing that caused that albinism, the lack of color, is a change, a variation, a mutation in the genes. Here's another example. This is not a picture of an albino baby. This is a picture of this couple's child. But you can imagine that when the little girl was born, there was some question over the parentage. In 2013, this picture went viral, but DNA testing was able to show that, yes, the little baby there is indeed the child of both of the parents, but she is a freak. She just happened to get the white color genes, which were hiding in the background of the genetics of both of these very dark-skinned people. And by the way, the little girl is not an albino, not like the dolphin we saw before. She does have skin pigment, so she'll go out in the sun and she'll tan like most of us, but she will definitely look very different to her mum and dad. And here's another classic example of a genetic mutation. These bulls and cows are often called double-muscled. They're not, in fact, double muscled. They have about 30% extra muscle mass, but the muscle's got nowhere to go, so it's kind of got to bulge out. And this is a natural genetic mutation which affects a protein called myostatin. But again, we'll talk about how this happens and what it means, and the implications of myostatin deficiency later on in the course. But there's a third example of how genetics can explain something really quite bizarre and weird and freaky. Well, it's all pretty exciting and interesting to see some of the weird and freaky things that happen in nature, and we can now work out that the causes of this lie in the cells and, in fact, in the DNA of the organisms. But now that scientists know where these changes, where this variation is coming from, they have the opportunity to, or the potential to, change those things. And in particular, the most obvious example is to change genetic diseases. Cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy are probably diseases you've heard of. Down syndrome is a condition you certainly have heard of. And various forms of colour blindness are all examples of genetic disorders. The problems come from the genes. Now, each of the ones I've mentioned is caused in very different ways. But if biologists now know that a particular set of genes is going to cause Huntington's disease or cystic fibrosis, is it possible to fix that up? And that, of course, is one of the big questions in genetics. Another one is, well, if we can change diseases, can we simply change, or can we, not simply, but can we also change other characteristics of organisms to make them better than they would be otherwise? Not just not sick, but faster, more productive, more intelligent, if you're talking about humans. If we're talking about crops, more disease resistant, more drought resistant, able to produce more food, more biomass. So these are definitely in the minds of genetic engineers, genetic scientists. And the reason why this course is important, not just as a matter of scientific interest, but these sort of questions, these issues are going to come up for us as people living in a society which is able to change its world. And GMOs, I'm sure you've heard of them, genetically modified organisms, are a fact of life already, and they will become more and more a fact of life. And we're going to have to make decisions about genetic engineering for ourselves and for our consumer choices. If you saw any of the Jurassic Park movies, the original book by Michael Crichton began with the idea that in certain little pieces of amber, that's fossilized tree sap, biologists have found insects. That's not fiction, that's true. Some of those insects are parasites, such as mosquitoes, and Michael Crichton proposed the idea, well, if mosquitoes have been sucking the blood of dinosaurs before they got trapped, maybe they have dinosaur DNA inside them. And if they've got dinosaur DNA, why can't we extract that and rebuild T-Rex? So that's the basic idea of Jurassic Park. Now, that's a fanciful notion. Scientists have long since discarded that idea. That's not going to work to really resurrect the dinosaurs. But that sort of idea is still on the minds of genetic engineers. A rhinoceros eagle, half rhinoceros, half eagle. Also, this is a photoshopped image, clearly, and also fanciful and not possible for lots of different reasons. But the idea of creating transgenic organisms, which do have a part of one organism and part of another, or mainly one organism and parts of many others, is not just a theory, it's already a reality, and we'll cover that in the course too. Will we get humans sprouting samurai swords out of their fists? Well, no, that's not going to happen. But there are genetic scientists and organizations which are very interested in changing humans to be the best they can possibly be. America's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, better known as DARPA, you may have heard of DARPA, is very interested in this human engineering side of genetics, and they have predicted the following. They've predicted tailor-made soldiers who can go 40 hours without sleep and still maintain focus. Now, I don't know how you feel after doing an all-nighter for a biology assignment, but imagine going for 40 hours and still being able to function at pretty much top performance. Amazing, right? What about people who can store body fat to go for days without food? Well, the human body already does that. But what if we could do it much faster? That is, assimilate, take in the food energy faster, and then break it down and use it faster. Well, that would save in carrying rations in your pack when you are fighting a war. And finally, what about if you could regrow limbs that you had lost in combat? Now, all of these ideas are still very much fiction, but many things in the past that have been science fiction have turned into science reality. And if America's DARPA is proposing this, then you can be sure that they're working on it. And we need to start asking the question, well, is that right? One, it may be possible to do, but is it right to do? It may be possible to do, but is it always going to work? And what happens if it doesn't work? And what happens if it does work? Well, if we don't understand the difference between the reality and the fiction, and if we don't have an understanding of the science, then we are not very well equipped to answer those questions or enter into that debate. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background of genetics, the sort of territory we're going to cover in terms of why we would want to be interested in genetics and what genetics can do for us generally as humans through science. In this last part, I want to talk a bit about a concept which is going to come up again and again in our lessons. And that is this concept of DNA being a code. Now, you've heard of the DNA code before and no doubt have done some lessons in science about DNA. So I don't think that this is going to be totally new to you, but let's discuss it anyway, because I find it very helpful to have in the back of my head as this concept that, or I shouldn't say a concept, this is a symbol, if you like, or a metaphor, a way of understanding genetics in terms of something that's more familiar to us. So the DNA is a code which is turned into something else. It's turned, in the end, into activities in our cells. And by those activities, things get made, things get changed, things get moved, things get broken down. But the DNA doesn't do any of that. The DNA gives the instructions for the body to do that. And we can think of this like a manual for a car or even a recipe book. If I want to make a cake, I can't buy the ingredients from the supermarket and then stick the book in the middle of them and hope that the cake's going to come out. No, I read the instructions and then I use my hands and my feet and my arms to mix the ingredients and tear open the packet and put it in stir it up and put it in the oven. The code, the book, the instructions tell me what to do with the ingredients. And DNA is the same. It doesn't do anything. It tells the cell how to do stuff. And so if we think of DNA as this book of code, the book actually, and quite literally and quite really, has some smaller parts. And as we go through the course, we're going to learn about those smaller parts. So the DNA code, or this book of DNA, actually has letters, actually has words, and actually has sentences. And finally, it has pages which then get bound together or put together into the whole book. And so this symbol, this concept, if you imagine a recipe book with with the individual letters of the alphabet put into words, and then those words put into sentences instructing us what to do to make our cake, and then we have a whole bunch of recipes all together, and so we get a complete recipe book. That is what each of our cells has. And I'm going to keep coming back to this symbol or this metaphor for DNA again and again through the course. And I hope that that sets you up to think about genetics, think about the theory to come, and put everything into context.